Hi. So last time we talked about political and legal system differences that you are likely to encounter as you do business internationally. Today we're going to talk about some more differences, and more specifically we are going to talk about the differences in economic systems and how they can manifest themselves and what that means for you as a business person who does business internationally. First, a little theory, and as you probably know, the economic systems can be positioned along a continuum where on the one hand you have free market, on the other hand you have a planned economy, and then you have all kinds of combinations of the two in between. I probably don't have to give you the definitions. I'm sure you know what a free market is versus what a planned economy is. I will just add that most people don't quite know where their nation falls on that continuum. For example, when I ask my students where do they think the United States would be on this continuum, most people would choose A, so they believe that they have a pure free market economy. When I ask them, for example, where they think the Chinese economy falls or what type of economic system they have, most people would choose E, which is a pure planned economy. The truth is that most countries are actually much closer to the middle than we think, and even the United States or Switzerland or other free market economies as we know them are not quite a pure case of a free market economy, as well as the most planned economies, perhaps with the exception of North Korea or maybe Cuba, are actually not as planned as many people think they are. I would also normally ask my students which system do they think is better, and again, if I ask that question in the United States or just about any other Western country like Europe, for example, most students would say that yes, a free market economy is better. At the same time, it's important to understand and realize that a huge portion of the population of this planet, including many people in the free market economies like in the United States, are not unequivocally for free market economies. Many people would actually support quite a large extent of state regulation. Others would propose some sort of a mixed approach where the state still regulates something. So it's impossible, or probably would be improper, to dismiss the calls and preferences of those people. They cannot be completely wrong here. And so in this lecture we're going to discuss the pros and cons of each of the systems, and hopefully we will know better what is available and what consequences we are likely to see if we choose one or the other system, and then hopefully you will be in a better position to choose for yourself which system you would personally prefer. Now, I strongly recommend that you stop here and watch the two video cases that I put in the optional readings or optional videos. The two are 60-minute programs of about two different companies. One is SAS, which is located incidentally right here in North Carolina, just about an hour from where I'm recording this video lecture. The other one is Lincoln Electric, which is just further east, northwest from here. So again, not too far away. The videos are a little older, so Lincoln Electric must have been made sometime in the 90s, and the SAS video must have been made sometime in the 2000s. So, but they still remain, on the one hand, as relevant as it gets, but more important, they still portray very well the different approaches that the two companies use with respect to their employee management. And so the way, or the reason I show those videos, and yes, please pause here, watch them, and then listen to what I have to say here, is so the way I show them is to kind of help my students open up their minds to possibilities that some other systems that they don't like with respect to the economic systems may actually be not as bad as their emotional minds tell them they are. So I would normally first take a poll and ask my students what economic system they would prefer to live in. always, inevitably, invariably, pretty much all of the students select either a pure free market economy or some sort of a mixed economy with a tendency towards free market economy as a preferred way or a preferred place to live and operate business. However, after I showed them Lincoln Electric and SAS, when I asked my students which of the two companies they would prefer to work for, presuming that it's the same position. For example, would they prefer to be an accountant for Lincoln Electric or SAS? Interestingly, about 90% of the students choose to work for SAS. And if you've now watched the videos, and I strongly recommend that you do, you would see that working for SAS is pretty much like living in a communist country. The country, or in this case the company, takes care of most of your needs. Your salary is kind of decent but not outstanding, not particularly high. The company in a sense controls many aspects of your life, or provides for many aspects of your life, and clearly the company could have chosen to take the money they spend on all those social programs and give them to you in a form of additional payment. So in a sense, the company taxes your salary to provide those additional services. Yet most of the people I ask that question seem to be perfectly fine with that, and they are fine with getting or spending part of their salary on the services that the company provides to them and working still for that company. Lincoln Electric, on the other hand, is a wonderful example of a pure free market approach. So the salaries are very high, but there is no safety net. So you work for the company. As long as you perform, you make a lot of money, but the company is not responsible for anything other than basically your regular work. So there would be no health insurance, there would be no social services and other types of safety measures that a company normally provides. So you are on your own, and yes, it pays as long as you are doing well, but if something goes wrong, you are on your own. And while again it's a wonderful representation of the real, pure, unregulated economy, when you ask people in the context of the companies which one they want to work for, they tend to choose SAS, which basically is equivalent to voting for, if not pure communism, then for socialism. And so we normally would discuss that with the students for a while, and many of them then become more receptive to the idea that, well, maybe a socialist economy is not as bad as they always thought it was. And again, the point of this exercise is not to tell that, for example, free market is bad and socialism is good. No, by no means. It's just to help you realize that when we say the words communism or socialism versus capitalism, we tend to think here. So we tend to think with our emotions. We tend to rely on propaganda or I guess indoctrination that we've been subjected to for the many years or decades of our lives. Whereas when you remove that terminology, emotional terminology, out of the picture and talk purely about what I get and what I give in exchange, people actually tend to be much more open as to what kind of system they want to live in, and are surprised to compare their answers to the first set of questions versus the other set of questions, because first they tend to be very pro-free market, and then they tend to be very pro-socialism, and hopefully that makes them as well as you think and be more open to the discussion that will follow in this lecture. And as I said, you may believe whatever you want, but the split in terms of the opinions of the 7 billion of the population on this planet is actually not as strong in favor of whatever you favor. It's actually more almost 50-50. And so I just encourage you to keep in mind that the other 3.5 billion people, or whatever the number, but it's definitely in billions, cannot be all dumb and misinformed. I mean, there may be something to their system that you probably don't notice. If you are from Europe, for example, which tends to be much more socialist, you probably know that there is no line of immigrants from, for example, the United States coming to Europe. I mean, yes, some people move, but not many. So that should probably tell you that while you personally may prefer socialism, people in North America seem to be perfectly content with capitalism, and vice versa. If you are in America, for example, well, somehow all those Europeans, especially the ones in Northern Europe that have a socialist system, don't all emigrate to the United States. Again, I wouldn't call them dumb. I mean, probably they know something about that system and they like something about that system that keeps them there. So just keep that in mind and be open to their points of view. So going back to how would the countries place on this free market economy versus centrally planned economy continuum, as you would see, you have the United States as one of the most kind of purest market economies, but again, it's not the extreme. It's definitely close to it, but it's still a mixed economy. On the opposite end, you would have Cuba, North Korea, that are probably as close as it gets to centrally planned economies. Though again, even there, you have some traces of unplanned kind of private enterprise, especially in Cuba, which in 2014, with Fidel Castro stepping down and Raul Castro taking power, it seems like some private initiatives, business practices, enterprising are now allowed and maybe even encouraged. So we're going to see probably a shift in Cuba from a planned economy to some sort of a mixed economy, and maybe even eventually to capitalism. Another thing I would like to point out on this graph is that the United States and Canada are very close together. From the United States, Canada often looks like a socialist country, and Americans tend to talk about Canadians as socialists. Canadians, on the other hand, tend to differentiate themselves from Americans by pointing out how more socialist they are and how more capitalist Americans are. But if you look at the entire continuum, if you look at a wider range of countries, you will actually see that both Canada and the United States are not that different after all. And yes, it is true that in Canada you have socialized healthcare. In some provinces you may have some other social services offered at a larger scale than they would be in the United States. But overall, both countries are very, very high on the, score high on the free market economy approach. In fact, some things in Canada would actually be more free than they are in the United States. Like, for example, opening a business takes a little less time in Canada. Corporate taxes are a little lower in Canada. There are some areas of business life that are actually less regulated in Canada than they are in the United States. So it's not as simple or not as white and black as it may appear from Canada or the United States. Now, here is a question that I'd like you to try and answer. This one is likely to appear on the exams, so you might want to give it some thought. And the correct answer obviously is D, so B and C are both true. Now let's talk about each system one by one and try to analyze the pros and cons of each. And so centrally planned economy, as you probably can guess by the definition or by the term, it's an economy where most aspects of economic life are planned centrally. So presumably the welfare of the group here is paramount, and economic and social equality is the goal, and the government owns most land, factories, and other economic resources and regulates all economic activity. The examples would be probably the Soviet Union, Russia of the 1917 and on, especially in the first decades of its existence, probably China, again in the early stages of its communist rule, Cuba to some extent still, North Korea probably would be the best example as of today. If I were to ask you what are the opponents' arguments against planned economy, you probably can easily come up with many answers, many points. We all, at least people in the Western world, and I'm talking here about Europe, I'm talking here about North America, Latin America, to a large extent parts of Asia, you all have heard many times why planned economy is bad, basically why Soviet Union didn't survive. And you probably know those arguments, but let me recap. Well, one and probably the biggest argument against a planned economy is that this system provides few, if any, incentives to innovate, to show initiative, to be proactive, to actually work harder. Under a planned economy condition, typically the pay tends to be fixed, or at least it was in the Soviet Union or in North Korea, in Cuba. There would be some differentiation for some positions, like for example, if you happen to be an assembly line worker or maybe some sort of a factory worker where you have a piece rate type of work design, then yes, you may be paid based on how much you do. And in that case, you may be able to earn more by working harder, in which case you probably will work harder. But for most other positions historically in planned economies, people would be getting the same pay. There would be some gradation in terms of your level of education, maybe your level in the hierarchy. In the Soviet Union, they also had some differentiation based on your area of residence. They had 3, I believe, or 4 what they called belts: first, second, third, fourth. And so first, that was Ukraine, so kind of warmer, milder climate. And so there the prices were somewhat lower, but also salaries were lower. The third or fourth belt, that would be far north, and so the climate there is harsh, working conditions are harsh, so salaries would be somewhat higher, though often the prices would also be higher. Other than that, it didn't really matter if you work hard or don't work at all. Your salary was more or less fixed within your gradient, and you can not show to work, or just do your bare minimum and you would still get the same pay, or you can work your butt off and still get the same pay. My parents were both engineers, and my dad had a lot of inventions and patents, and so at that time they had what they called a workbook. It's like your basically transcript at school. Every time you switch jobs or do something good or bad, there would be a record in that book. And so he has lots of them. In fact, he had so many of those inventions and improvement suggestions that they had to add additional pages to his books so it can be all recorded there. And so one of the things that is recorded in that book is how much he was paid for all those engineering solutions. And funny enough, some of them were paid at literally 20 cents. I mean, at that time that was probably equivalent to a public transit ticket, so whatever you would pay to take a bus today. Yes, he kind of got something, but in reality those incentives were so weak that most people would do more, not for the money, but just for the fun of it, for the game. So obviously at the same time, all entrepreneurial activities wouldn't be allowed. So you either work for the state company or you don't work at all. Everything else would be labeled black market and would be illegal. And so your only way to earn more money would be to literally just show up to work, and if you happen to have a job where it's piece rate, you can actually make much more than the head of the factory, just because his salary is fixed. So some people would also kind of compensate themselves for higher performance by stealing. I mean, stealing was so widespread that it became almost part of the culture. And by stealing, I don't mean stealing from your neighbors. That was absolutely no. But taking property from your company, that was not only normal, it was almost expected. So in fact, when I came to the United States for the first time in the 90s, must have been late 90s, one type of stores that I was most surprised about, and I bet you will never guess which one it is. In fact, when I asked that question of my students, they would come up with all kinds of, like Walmart and something else. No, we did have grocery stores, we did have all kinds of, clothing stores. But in the Soviet Union, what we didn't really have, or at least not on a large scale, so not like, everywhere as it is here, and those would be hardware stores, like the Home Depot, Lowe's. In Europe, I'm not sure what would be the chain, not quite IKEA, so stores that sell, like nails and lumber and all other types of construction materials. And I'm not sure why we didn't have many of them. I mean, there would be probably some somewhere, but it's definitely, it's a small little shack somewhere, maybe one for the entire town. In fact, in my hometown of 250,000 people, we had one, must have been like 20 square meter store, like really small one, and the only one. I mean, smaller towns didn't even have that. And the reason for that, it seems, was that if you needed some like concrete or nails or screws, you wouldn't go to a store. You would go to the company where you work, or whatever's the nearest company, and sometimes with a bottle of vodka and sometimes maybe with some cash. and you would just come to the guy who is responsible, you know, like the warehouse guy, and you say, well, I need some nails, I'm doing some renovation at home, could you give me some? And you just take it. I mean, people would take stuff from the collective farms, and it was kind of illegal, but I mean, it was so widespread and so expected that, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, it wasn't a problem. Or if a house being built not too far from where you live, I mean, if you need any construction materials, you just go, you talk to the guys there, they give it to you, you sometimes pay to them, sometimes don't, sometimes you just show up at night when nobody's there and you just take it. And yeah, so there was no need for those kinds of stores, and so that's clearly a problem. So the only real motivation in the planned economy to work harder would be to either do some black market activity, so private enterprising that is illegal, which you probably wouldn't want to do, or those motivational posters that you have here on the, you know, slides. So this particular one says 5-year plan in 4 years. As you know, the planned economies, at least historically, tended to have those state plans. In the Soviet Union, it was every 5 years. China still has that. And yeah, so they had all those motivational posters that presumably encouraged people to work harder. Another big problem with the planned economy is that it doesn't emerge naturally. So again, historically, all of those systems had been installed by force. The Soviet Union is the best example, and that's the one I know. And so in the 1917 and 18, when it was formed, and then in 1939 when it spread all the way to Western Ukraine, where I'm from, it was basically by force, through nationalization. People would have some land, would have some property, and then the state comes and takes it forcefully, and so that's how it was done. And it's unnatural. People are born and evolved to own, to be free, to have, you know, freedom of choosing how they do things and if they do them or not. And when you try to impose rules and try to centralize it, and so that the government tells me what I can do and what I can own, people rebel. It's not normal. And every time you had that system, it was through a bloodshed. Here is a picture of a Red Army soldier who guards the property seized from what they called kulaks. So that's basically just farmers, you know, people in smaller towns who had some property and who refused to join the collective farms as the Soviet Union was created. And most of them just vanished in Siberia. Some were killed right there, and so their property was seized. They were announced the contra, so anti-revolutionary elements and the enemies of the state. And yes, as you can see, you know, with the guns and everything. So it wasn't a peaceful, voluntary process by no means. And so if you happen to be a proponent of that system, well, building it wouldn't be easy. It's against the human nature. Now, and this is very important, a planned economy relies on individuals, people who make those plans. And the way it would work, literally, it would be a bunch of economists, and the number would be quite large for larger countries and smaller for smaller countries, who get together once in a while on a 5-year cycle and try to plan what's the country going to do for the next 5 years. So they literally would plan how many units of each good would be made over the 5 years, who would make them, where, how many employees will be needed. So they basically plan for everything. And it's very difficult. I mean, it's close to impossible, and in many cases they would overplan or overestimate the need for some products, underestimate the need for others, and so inevitably some things don't go according to the plan, and you would have shortages. And again, here is a picture from the Soviet Union where people line up to buy stuff. And frequently, in fact, I still remember that in the 80s. I mean, I still caught a glimpse of that. As a child, you would be walking with your parents on the street, and you see a long, long line. I mean, we're talking like, you know, sometimes blocks long. And you get in line often even before you know what's being sold, because many things are in short supply, and the prices are fixed as well by the state. So the prices are fairly low. You don't have, you have enough money to buy that stuff if it's available, but it's just not available. So when you see a line, you just get in line because you know there's something there that you want to buy, and you'll figure out what it is later, because whatever that is, you need it, and you probably have the money to buy it. It just, it's in the short supply. Another kind of side product or a problem is that because humans have a limited capacity, for cognitive processing, they would try to simplify, and so the range of products and goods available to the people in a planned economy tends to be very narrow. And so going back to the Soviet Union times that I still remember, literally, there were a very limited number of varieties that you would buy, just for about any product. Like there were literally like 2 basic types of underwear for men, blue and black. There were probably 2 or 3 different types of like exercise suits, that you would wear for a gym class. And I still remember there was this blue one, like, like light cotton type of stuff. And like literally when you come to school, even though parents shop at different stores, I mean, all the kids would be wearing the same, more or less, types of goods. And I don't do it anymore, just because now I live in a region where there are not many people from the former Soviet Union. In fact, there are none. I don't know any. But when I was still in Calgary, where there was a sizable population of the people from former Soviet Union, sometimes when we would get together, one of the kind of activities we would do is we would try to remember prices for different products, and different products that you in general remember. And remarkably, we still remember fairly well. Like there were 3 different types of ice cream, and I remember there was one for 13 cents, or kopeykas, of ruble. There was another one for 22 cents. There were those kind of running shoes that were 5.50. So I mean, yes, there were so few of them, and the prices didn't really change because they were planned for the entire 5 years, and often for longer. That they didn't change. And I'm not sure if I would call that as a negative, a negative side of planned economy. I mean, the quality was fine, and the prices were fine. In fact, often quality was quite good, especially for some types of goods. So I guess, a limited variety, I mean, if anything, it kind of, frees you from the need to make too many choices. And recent research shows that people get paralyzed when they have too many choices. So the curse of choice. So, but still, taken to an extreme, I wouldn't want to experience that anymore. I mean, I kind of like the variety. I like the options. And so, yeah. So another problem, again, when humans have to plan for, for many years for a large country, not only do they make suboptimal choices in many cases, they also pretty much eliminate natural selection. So if they determine that this is the type of product that is needed, and this is what will be made for 5 years, this is what will be made for 5, and in many cases for many more years. So if a better product comes along, or if it becomes, some new product is proposed, it wouldn't be made. I mean, it wasn't planned for. So there was no natural competition. I mean, the same thing would be made over and over again, and a better thing wouldn't have a way to make it way through, or at least not as quickly as it should. So obviously it's a problem. Now here I would like to offer you an activity and just illustrate to you how limited is human ability to plan. So when I ask my students how many ball tosses, passes they counted, I mean, many of them get the right answer, but the funny thing is that most of them never saw the gorilla. And you would think, it's such an obvious thing. I mean, how could you not see the gorilla? But they still don't. I mean, it still happens. So clearly a problem. And then here's another exercise. I mean, can you count every F in the following text? If you are like most, you probably see only 4 F's. In reality, there are 6. And when I tell you that there are 6, you're like what? Well, the thing is that people don't see F's in the off. So you didn't see probably this one here, and this one here in off. And again, it's a very simple test, but if you are like most, and usually it's about 80% of the students who flunk it. So if you're like most, you couldn't do it. I mean, and now imagine I'm going to ask you to plan for the needs of different products for an entire country for an entire 5-year period. I mean, if you couldn't do this, how much better are you at doing something else? Finally, and this is probably most important, when the Soviet Union was formed, or China, when China became communist, or Cuba, at that time, yes, we did have globalization kind of in its infancy, but the countries could still operate fairly independently from one another. Today the situation is drastically different. Today the world is intertwined, and many, if not most, things are not within your control, within a control of a particular country. So yes, you may have the most wonderful plan for your country, but you probably today depend more than ever on foreign suppliers, on global geopolitics, on other things that happen outside your country. And you can plan all you want, but if, let's say, for example, a thing happens in Russia, the oil prices change, or supply of oil becomes limited, or something blows up in the Middle East and prices go up, your plan is basically useless now, because you planned for a particular good being available at a particular time at a particular price, and now it's not. So unless it's some sort of a fluid mechanism, planning, especially long term today, when you can't control everything, just won't work. Now let's talk about the supporters' arguments. I mean, yes, we all know what are the negative sides of a planned economy, but let's talk about what are the positive sides, and what would the proponents of the system say. This is a more difficult question for people from the Western cultures, as we grew up to like and know the free market economy. But there are some notable positives about the planned economy. One, when everything is planned centrally, at least in theory, the economy tends to be or work as one coherent machine. It's definitely easier to implement change. The guy on the top says this is what we're going to do, everybody does it. Occasionally it actually may be a positive thing. For example, again, looking at the Soviet Union, Second World War completely destroyed, and with a planned economy, they were able to rebuild it fairly well within a few years. I mean, by the mid-50s, the country was actually doing remarkably well. And yes, the cost of that was huge and, terrible. But the centrally planned approach kind of allowed for that quick change and implementation. Other important things would be, if the economy is planned, you wouldn't have those fluctuations. You wouldn't have the ups and downs of the economic cycle. And you wouldn't have the crisis, you wouldn't have the inflation. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's all, good, I mean, absolute good. But if you don't like the economic crisis and recessions and depressions, then a planned economy is for you, because that doesn't happen there, or at least, is not planned for and shouldn't happen. The focus tends to be more long-term, and so rather than serving your today's selfish needs, at least in theory, the planning will serve the long-term interest of the society. Again, historically, it hasn't quite worked that way, but at least in theory, that's what it is. If you don't like unemployment, well, then you are a proponent, or you should consider a planned economy. In a planned economy, you just plan for the population and create the number of jobs, and as a result, everybody is employed. In fact, in the Soviet Union, unemployment or being unemployed was illegal. Literally, if you don't work for too long, and I'm not sure what the exact term was, but probably a few weeks, you would be either first you would be offered a job and placed somewhere, and if not, you would be arrested. And so it doesn't mean that everybody had a great job, but you couldn't be without any job, which again sometimes happens to some people in a free market economy. Inflation is a wonderful thing, meaning that when it's bad, but a planned economy doesn't have inflation. And as I was saying, prices literally wouldn't change for years and sometimes decades, and I can still recite at least 50 different prices for products that I still remember vividly, and exactly the exact price up to a penny, because all my childhood, the entire 80s, the price didn't change. It was the same price. So yeah, it was an important thing. You would also have less economic inequality. And again, I personally am not sure if I want to say that economic inequality is inherently bad, but if you believe that economic inequality is bad, then planned economy allows you to have less of that. And let me show you here a little graph that illustrates how wealth is distributed in different countries. And so here we have a scale, basically for the number of people and for income. And first we have the world here. And so as you can see, the distribution changes over time. So this is what we have in the 70s. And this is how it changes over time. So as you can see, the world is becoming richer, as well as kind of the middle class is taking shape. But let's take this graph for different countries. So for example, here we have Brazil. Brazil is a free market economy, always has been, or at least to a large extent. And this is what Brazil looked in 1970. So as you can see, there were some people who were comparatively rich, made in today's on average $10,000. There were people who made even more than that, but on average, this kind of rich class, this is what they made, a decent amount of money given their cost of living. And then you don't really have anyone in between, and then you have a lot of people who are kind of left behind and are the rest, the poor. And this is what's been happening over time. As you can see, the people are becoming richer and richer, but the gap between the rich and the poor also stays. In fact, it even seems to widen. And let's take a look at another, like Mexico, for example. Again, another free economy, another poor country, getting richer over time, but having this inequality in place. So now let's take a look at, for example, a more socialist country, like, for example, Japan. So Japan in the 70s was a comparatively rich country. The average Japanese was as rich as the rich Brazilian. There was some difference between the rich and the poor, so you kind of had the middle class, but you had some richer and you had some poorer, and this is what's been happening over time. As you can see, the country has been becoming more rich, but at the same time less unequal in terms of the wealth. So here is also China. If you look at China, again, China is a relatively rich, poor country, and in the 70s it was remarkably poor. Everybody was also not only remarkably poor, but remarkably equal in terms of the wealth. Hardly anyone was making more than this, and hardly anyone was making less than this. So this is what's been happening over time as China was becoming more capitalist, right? As the economy becomes less planned, you see the huge increase in income inequality. So now you, on average, see a much wealthier China, but there is a huge gap now between the rich and the poor. And more important, there seems to be this kind of gap forming where you have the rich and then fewer in between and then the poor. Just similar to what you see in Brazil, for example. And yes, China's population is larger, so the curve is higher, but you see that same tendency. If you look at the United States, just out of, as a special example, you would see that the United States in the 70s was very rich, much richer than everybody else. But it did have a sizable middle class and lots of rich people, but also kind of had this hump in the back. So it's people who are in a sense left behind, either for historic reasons or the system didn't work properly. But you would, unlike in Brazil where you have a few rich and then many poor, here you have many rich but a few poor who are left behind. And as you see, over time the country is becoming richer, but the divide between kind of most and the poor is widening. And I personally see that as a troubling trend. So that's something that, is a problem. And evidently, if you have a purely free, not a pure, but a close to a pure free market economy, sometimes you would have those kind of skewedness or those problems. Again, looking at Japan versus the United States, the average is roughly the same. The United States may be a little richer, but on average the countries are roughly the same. But in the United States you would see that on the one hand there are many very rich people, which is good, but there are also many very poor people, which is not good. So nobody in Japan is this poor, hardly anyone, whereas in the United States it's a whole huge class. So some see that as a problem. Now, going back to the stability and prices, as I was in Ukraine, must have been a year or 2 years ago, I found these toys. Those are dumbbells for exercising, and as I told you, the prices were fixed, or remained fixed for a long period of time. And not only were they fixed, they were literally ingrained on the product. Like, for example, here you see a 3-kilogram dumbbell was 57 cents, right? And so you couldn't change it. I mean, that's the thing, and that's the price, and it was for a long time. And this is a 4-kilogram dumbbell, and it's a 75-cent price. Again, stamp ingrained in steel. So even if the store wanted to change it, they couldn't. So good or bad, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to be a judge here. It was kind of nice, to have that stability here. You go to a store and every day it's a different price. But then for the economy, obviously, prices should change as the demand and supply changes. So I actually see this as a negative. It's a comforting thing at the personal level, or convenient thing at the personal level, but definitely a negative thing for the country as a whole. Now, here is one that is very difficult to refute or argue with, and I'm not sure if you would be able to come up with a refutal of this argument. It actually goes all the way back to Karl Marx, the father of the planned economy paradigm, socialism or communism, and in his work Das Kapital. So he was criticizing the free market economy or a capitalist society by pointing out that in a free market economy it is possible that the resources may be misallocated, so that, in his example, it was the milk would go to a dog of a rich person at the time when just a few miles away a child of a poor person would be going to bed hungry. And if I had to translate it in today's language, I would say that, for example, here in the United States, I mean, people on average are rich, but even in this very town, there are pockets, areas kind of south of the Lee Street that are not doing so well. Just like in most American cities, you would have those, sometimes they're unethically called ghettos, where people are pretty poor and desperate, especially in these dire economic times. And it's not unusual for the kids in those areas in today's developed United States to go to bed, unfed, hungry. And that's at the time when just a few miles away, in the area, for example, where I live, is kind of the better, richer part of the town, where you would literally have like an animal spa where you can bring your animals for, like a massage and a haircut, or like the American Girl store. My daughter goes there on a regular basis. They started making those American Doll toys, and not only the toy itself cost more than my first car, for God's sake, but when you go to the store, you can literally, your doll can go through like a makeup session and a hairstyling session. And so the resources are spent that way. Now, I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. I mean, if I have a cat and I want to feed my cat the way I want to feed my cat, or if my daughter wants to, give a haircut to my to her doll in a store, and pay for that, whatever, $20 or whatever they pay. I don't want anyone to tell me that I cannot do that. I mean, I've earned that money, and I should be able and want to be able to spend it the way I want. But at the same time, it is troubling me that at the time when I'm spending all that money on kind of unnecessary luxuries, I guess, in a sense, there are people in this very town who are, could be using that money, for a better cause. And I'm talking here not so much even about the, touchy-feely kind of ethical, moral things. I'm talking about it from the perspective that what if a child of that poor person somewhere in a bad neighborhood has the potential, the brains to become the next Einstein or, the next Mozart. And the only reason the child will not become the next Einstein or Mozart and will not make a valuable contribution to the society is because that child's parents are poor, and the child may not be, getting all the attention he or she needs, may not have access to, classes, education, musical instruments, and as a result, the child may grow up, unsuccessful, marginally employed person, whereas he or she actually had a potential to make the world a better place, and thereby benefit me and my kids. So I don't know, it's a tough argument, and it is true that at least in theory, in a planned market economy, those misallocations of resources wouldn't happen. Though, and this is very important, I should point that out, very, very important, that this is theory. In practice, if you look at planned economies, especially like North Korea or Cuba, I don't know, in theory, yes, problems shouldn't be happening there, but in reality they are, and believe me, they happen much more often than they do in a free market economy. And I don't know, if I had to choose where my kids grow up, I would go with a free market economy, even though in theory it's possible, and in practice it is happening, that the system doesn't always work perfectly as it should. Because in a planned economy, while the theory is wonderful, the practice is much, much worse. All right, here is a question for you, so see if you can answer it. And the correct answer is E. Those are all arguments of the proponents of the planned economy. Now let's talk about the free economy, free market economy. And the truth is that it's basically the opposite of the planned economy as far as the pro and con arguments. So let me just recap them so you definitely have them in your head. Well, the positives would be clearly, a free market economy provides an incentive to work hard, because the harder you work, the more you make, and vice versa. The less you work, the less you make. And so people work hard because, that's how they get rich, and they get poor if they don't work. You have this invisible hand described by Adam Smith that somehow miraculously allocates the resources to where they need it most. If there is a need for a particular good, there will be an entrepreneur who will create supply of that good, and by doing so, the resources will be taken from where they are available to where they are needed. And in free market economies, parents tend to understand that and tend to introduce their kids to entrepreneurial activities early on in their age. Like my kids now are still fairly young, but they already have the experience of for example, making lemonade and selling it and earning some pennies that way, which hopefully will help them in their future lives. And yes, the statistics shows that economic freedom is associated with economic prosperity. So if you look at the plot that shows the GDP per capita versus the freedom or the type of the economy, there is a clear correlation. So the more unrestricted the economy is, the richer the people tend to be. And it seems to be a universal relationship, and there are some notable exceptions, but generally it actually works. The relationship is pretty linear and pretty strong. Now, we talked about the dog and milk, so those would be the opponents' arguments. And as I said, I historically know that this argument makes no sense or is not the case, but theoretically it's a tough one to deal with, so maybe you can decide for yourself how to counter it. Another one is that in a free market economy, self-interest is above all, which is kind of good, but potentially can lead to a situation where the personal incentives are so strong that the national incentives or groups' incentives are becoming secondary. And I encourage you to watch a documentary called The Corporation. It's an older one from about 10 years ago, but it's a very wonderful documentary that shows how sometimes in the free market economy, individuals who run corporations make choices that are not in favor of the society. I'll give you an example of how that may be the case. So, for example, if you happen to be a manager at a company in a planned market economy, if you drastically improve financial performance of your company, you will not really get much in exchange in the form of your pay. I mean, there may be something, but it's not going to make you much richer or much poorer. So as a result, you probably will make the decision in favor of the society, because even if you try to serve your self-interests, it's not a huge difference for you. I mean, there is some incentive, no doubt, but not as huge as it would be otherwise. In a free market economy, the losses and gains may be tremendous, huge. If you are a manager, like CEO of, let's say, Monsanto, a large chemical company, and one of your costs is utilization of toxic waste, you have a huge incentive to dump that stuff into the publicly shared atmosphere or rivers, because that will drastically cut the cost of your production, which in turn will have a positive effect on the financial performance of your firm. And given that you probably have some sort of profit sharing or stock options, it will make you substantially richer. And it sounds like, no, it's not going to apply to me, but here's the question. I mean, you do something stupid, you dump some sort of chemical that maybe over the next 20 years will increase the cancer rate by 1%, but you make $1 million today in exchange. And so what is going to be? And I'd like to believe that all of you will sacrifice your personal $1 million for the sake or good of the community. But I don't know. I mean, evidence shows that when people are faced with that choice, often it's made in favor of personal gains. And I wouldn't even say what I'm going to do in this case. I don't know. I mean, I hope I will never have to make that choice. Same applies to, for example, promotion of harmful and addictive products, like, for example, junk food and all those tobacco and energy drinks and gambling and video games. It's a free economy. We make money whichever way we want. And so as long as there is no restriction, there will be always people who will be happy to sell you junk food, narcotics, products that are harmful for you. But, hey, nothing personal, it's just business. In a planned economy, at least in theory, you can restrict the production and distribution of those products. And yes, if you look at planned economies, like the former Soviet Union, like Cuba, North Korea, with all their negatives, harmful products are not sold right and left, or at least not knowingly sold. You wouldn't have all those energy drinks that are hugely addictive and have, a bucket worth of coffee in them. You wouldn't have all those, like cigarettes with whatever they put in them today, so that stuff wouldn't be available. And again, historically, it's not as clean and pure, and, the planned economies were no paradise by no means. But some of these things, were kind of working in their favor, so, just keep that in mind. Opponents also say that a free market economy is slow to implement change, and it takes anywhere between 9 to 12 months from the time there is a demand for a product till the time the product is introduced to the market, because it takes time for the entrepreneur to recognize the need, to secure the financing, to implement it, to go through the competition and finally deliver the product. But hey, I mean, I find this argument bogus. If you look at the planned economies, then yes, I mean, changes like that or new products to the market often would take years and years. I mean, a 5-year plan, I mean, here we're talking about. So I guess, yes, it is, all it's telling us that the free market economy is not perfect, but historically and even theoretically, it's actually better in terms of, the speed at which the changes are happening compared to the planned economy. A few examples of where planned economy seems to excel compared to the free market economy. For example, it appears that alternative energy sources and, for example, electric vehicles will be the way of the future. And it appears that we should be investing in those technologies today. In a free market economy, like for example the United States or Canada, there are notable advances in this area, but still China makes more electrical vehicles than pretty much the rest of the world combined. And the reason for that is because in China, a 5-year plan recognized the importance of this new technology, and they planned for it. So they recognize that this is where the future lies, and this is what we're going to do, and they're just basically almost mandatory, centrally planned, implementing this new technology. And we're yet to see who's going to win, and I bet that the United States will do equally well, especially now that Tesla and some other companies here, GM, are experimenting with this technology, so we'll see. But so far, China seems to be winning in this competition, and so far it seems like being, using some elements of planning in the economy may not be such a bad thing. Again, we'll see how it goes, because the United States did try to plan as well for some of those newly emerging technologies. And here you see a picture of President Obama visiting the Solyndra. It's a company that was making electrical solar batteries. And the state, the government provided quite a lot of money or financing to those companies, so basically grants and funds to develop the technology. And this particular company where the picture was taken actually went bankrupt. So many people now question the wisdom of all that investment, public investment, money from my pocket, from the taxes that I paid, given to that company, because it didn't work out in the end. So maybe it should have been left to its own device, and if the technology is viable, it will survive and prosper. If it's not, maybe we shouldn't spend public money on it. So not so simple. Here's another question for you. Let's see if you would know the answer. And the answer again is E. All of these are arguments of the opponents of the free market economy. Now, mixed economy presumably is the golden middle, so presumably takes the best and the best of the both worlds. And yes, the data does show that in mixed economies the unemployment tends to be somewhat lower, there tends to be steady economic growth, and they tend to do better than the two extremes that we just discussed. When you look at the statistics, or for example the European Union, that tends to be much more socialist, and the United States that tends to be much more capitalist, how should I put it? Europe seems to be doing fairly well overall in the long run, and there were times when Europe was actually doing better than the United States. When you look at the quality of life, when you look at all kinds of indices that measure, the economic development and prosperity of the continent, many countries in Europe actually do remarkably well and score higher than the United States, especially Northern European countries. At the same time, and I should comment on that, when the economic crisis of 2008 struck, it was kind of interesting to see that the United States used a more kind of planned economy approach. There were all those bailout packages and the stimulus money, and the United States spent what it was like $2 trillion combined on basically planning and government interventions. Europe, even though in general it's much more socialist, actually took a more capitalist approach, and instead of pumping the public money and planning and government interventions, it actually started all those austerity measures and started cutting spendings and tightening the budget. So started doing what a capitalist society would do. Now in 2015, looking at the numbers, it actually seems like America is doing better. It actually seems like in America the unemployment rate is down and lower and faster down. It seems like American GDP is growing faster. So go figure. It actually seems like the capitalist society of the United States took a more socialist approach, and it actually worked better than what the more socialist Europe did with its more capitalist approach. So if anything, it seems to yet again show that a mixed approach, freedom generally, but some areas where the government plays a key role seems to work best. And again, the crisis is far from over, and we're not gonna know the ultimate outcome for quite some time, but so far it actually seems like some government intervention did help. So we'll see how it develops further. Now, a very important question becomes, all right, so let's say we've determined that the wild capitalism is not perfect, and let's agree that at least some areas of economy or of our lives should be regulated by the government. The question becomes, which ones? I mean, which ones do you think should be regulated by the government? For example, should anything and everything be allowed to be sold everywhere? For example, should it be allowed to sell narcotics on university campuses or in daycares? Probably not. I mean, I wouldn't want that to happen. So I would say that yes, some restrictions should be in place, but what exactly? Should advertising be regulated? Should companies be allowed to say whatever they want and claim any properties to their products? Or should there be some sort of oversight? Should healthcare be free or government regulated, or should it be completely left up to the medical providers and in many cases monopolies? How about education? Should it be free? Should it be government regulated? Or again, the government should completely distance itself from it and let people, figure out on their own. And if you don't have enough money to pay for your education, too bad for you. How about defense, army, central bank? I mean, evidently or clearly, some areas should be regulated. And so most people would agree that when it comes to regulation, so the following areas are the areas where the government should play a role. One, enforce antitrust laws. So you want the government to be able to oversee and, if needed, break up potentially threatening monopolies, or not allow creation of potentially threatening monopolies, like mergers of major players, specifically to keep the economy more competitive. And so while it's an intervention and it's anti-free market in a sense, it probably has more positives than negatives. The government should also be concerned with preserving property rights. I mean, it should have some sort of records of who owns what, and not allow property seizures under any conditions unless some sort of illegal activity is going on. Otherwise, again, the economy will not survive completely unregulated. And probably also the government should be tasked with fiscal and political stability. Army, police, central bank. You don't want to have a central bank, represented by a private company that has the license to print money as they wish. Or I'm not sure if you want to have a private company running your defense or army or police. You probably want that to be under the public control, and so that will constitute a mixed economy state, right? So now, probably the most important question is, now that you know that that economic systems differ, the big question becomes, how do you know which one is better? Well, you may like, for example, free market economy, or I may like, or somebody else may like, planned economy. How do you know who's right, who's wrong? I mean, you can argue all day, but unless you can express your arguments in numbers, we will not reach any conclusion. And the question becomes, what arguments, or what would you measure? How would you express the success of the economy in numbers? Here are some of the examples. One, obviously, you can look at economic performance as measured by GDP or GNP. By itself, the number is not very useful because different countries are different in size. Like, for example, the GDP of Switzerland is infinitely smaller than the GDP of China, but China is much bigger. So when you adjust it per capita, you will see that the GDP per capita of Switzerland is much higher than that of China. So that probably tells us that Switzerland is doing better than China does. The problem with this approach is, and there are many problems, is that GDP doesn't fully and even doesn't adequately capture economic development of a nation. in your optional readings, if you're taking this class for credit, there is a wonderful short article called The Rise and Fall of GDP, and it explains why GDP is a decent but overall a poor measure of economic success of a nation. And I'll give you a few examples. One is that GDP per capita doesn't quite illustrate the distribution of wealth. It just shows the average production of wealth per capita. In an extreme example, you can have a situation where all that wealth goes to one single individual, in which case the average may be high, but everybody is actually poor. And you would see that in, for example, today's Russia, where the GDP per capita is comparatively high. It's something around $14,000 per capita, but much of it is accumulated in the hands of a few. And so on average, or not on average as a arithmetical average, but as a median, so an average individual there is actually quite poor. Second, cost of living. Yes, GDP per capita may be high in one country and low in another, but if the prices are dramatically different, then it could be the case that individuals in a poor country can actually afford more with the money they make. Finally, GDP doesn't quite account for all the transactions and all the goods and services offered in that country. You would have all those no-receipt transactions, right? You would have all that black market going on, and it's just not accounted for. In some countries, it could be up to 90% of the entire economy being in the shadow, and so as a result, you just don't know that, and GDP doesn't account for that. Let me give you an example of how that could play out using my grandfather. So he was born, actually at that time I believe it was Poland. That part of the country was under Poland or Polish rule. Then it became independent Ukraine, then Soviet Union, then Ukraine again. But anyway, let's say we're talking here about the 80s, the Soviet Union time. The GDP per capita at that time was fairly low, about $3,500 per capita. But it didn't account for much of the wealth that people had at that time. So for example, my grandparents, they lived in a small town, and they had about 2 acres of land and 2 cows and a few pigs and a few domestic birds. So they would never buy vegetables or fruits or eggs or milk, so they would make that stuff domestically. Nobody accounted for that. I mean, it was not part of the GDP, but it was a savings or wealth of about, let's say, $1,500 a year. Plus they would actually have excess of that, and so they would sell excess of that, so they would sell some of it on the market and on bazaar, and probably make another equivalent of, I don't know what, about $500 or so a year. Then my grandfather was a carpenter, so he would make a lot of things both for his own family, and again not accounted, but also for neighbors, not accounted. In fact, when he died, I remember, it's a small town, and when somebody dies, the whole village gathers up and mourns the loss. And so I was asked to go door to door and bring some chairs, because we didn't have enough chairs to sit everyone, who showed up for the memorial service. And interestingly, as I was going from a door to door, as people were giving me the chairs, they would always, literally always say, "Oh, by the way, your grandfather made that chair." And yes, at that time, we didn't have IKEAs, and most of the furniture was made by a local, carpenter. Also we had a local blacksmith, and so there was this guy who lived 3 houses down. He was the blacksmith, and if you needed a knife or sickle, you would go and he would make that stuff for you. And if you needed some clothing, there was another guy also kind of living in that same area who was the tailor, and so much of the clothing that people had at that time was made by that person. And so my grandfather was a carpenter, so just about all the furniture in that town was made by him. And that was not accounted for. I mean, they would just basically, trade services. My grandfather would make you, some carpentry, and when the time comes to dig potatoes or plant potatoes, the neighbors would help him in exchange, and that's how it worked. So it's all wealth. I mean, it's definitely wealth, but it's just not accounted in GDP. So when you look at all those additional things, you would actually see that the GDP per capita in Ukraine, real production, at that time was about $8,000. So it's still substantially lower than it was in the United States, for example, but it's not 10 to 1 as the official figures would suggest. So, and that is true, you know, when you looked at, you know, people living in Ukraine at that time, they were not remarkably poorer than, for example, their American counterparts. They all still had some sort of housing, you know, an apartment or a house in the smaller town. Many had some sort of transportation. Again, the car could have been not as large or as, you know, expensive, fancy as it would be in the United States. Or Europe for that matter, but still many of them had something, and many still could go on some sort of vacation from time to time. So again, they were definitely not as rich as people in the, you know, kind of capitalist world, but not as poor as the official GDP per capita comparison would suggest. On top of that, you would see that the prices there were remarkably lower. So if you adjust the GDP per capita for what we call purchasing power parity, so basically for the cost of living, you would see that in Ukraine at that time it would have been actually more like 12,000. So, and then when you compare it to that of the United States, it's more like 1 to 3 rather than 1 to 10, a huge difference. So don't be enchanted with the GDP per capita, because while it's a useful indicator, it doesn't tell you much and doesn't tell you everything. Here is another important kind of refinement, and that's the purchasing power parity. Again, as we said, the cost of living is different in different countries, and simply looking at the GDP per capita, you may not quite know how much people can buy with that wealth. So for example, I have here a few countries, and as an example, let's take the United States with the base GDP per capita of $39.7 thousand, and it's somewhat higher now, but you know, I just keep it at that. Then you see Switzerland, where the GDP per capita is higher than in the United States by a whole almost $10,000, which may create an impression that the Swiss are richer than Americans. But then you look at the cost of living in Switzerland and adjust that money for what we call the purchasing power parity, and all of a sudden that number drops to $34.7 thousand, which means that while the Swiss produce more in terms of the actual, you know, dollar value, with those dollars they can buy less than what Americans can buy with their fewer dollars. So in reality, they can acquire less wealth with what they produce, even though they produce a larger number per capita of goods than what happens with Americans. Then when we look at, let's say, for example, Czech Republic, it's the opposite story. So the GDP per capita is much lower than in the United States. In fact, as small as 1/4 of that of America. But when you adjust it for the cost of living, for the lower prices, it actually increases by about 60%. And so you see that it becomes much, much higher. So, and I guess that kind of explains why when you go to the Czech Republic, people there don't look, you know, 1/4 as rich as Americans. There may be some difference, clearly, but again, not as huge as the official numbers would suggest. Now, here's a question that tests how you understood the PPP, purchasing power parity idea, and let's see if you know the answer. So we are talking here about a country that is like Switzerland, so which makes the first answer, A, to be the correct answer. Economic equality could be another measure of the success of the nation. Again, equality is not necessarily a goal. You don't want everyone to be equally rich or poor. You want some difference that reflects a difference in effort and skills and knowledge. But if it's too high, it's probably a problem. And when you look at the map here, you see that you know, Argentina, a few Latin American, African countries have the highest inequality. When you look at Europe and the United States, again, you will see that it's by no means uniform. In fact, the United States is kind of in the middle, so it has a fair amount of inequality in wealth. Canada does somewhat better, but not as good. Japan and some northern European countries seem to be most egalitarian. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that it's, you know, goal in and of itself, but it's probably better than inequality, at least, you know, in the extreme expressions. And so from this perspective, it seems like the northern European countries and Japan do better than some other European countries and the United States. Most troubling is here that the inequality is not only high, but also increasing both in the United States and in more capitalist European countries. And so that is a real troubling trend. So the United States in the 40s, 60s, 70s, in the years of its kind of glory and prosperity, was actually more egalitarian than it is now today. And I don't know, I don't like that trend very much. Now, is economic inequality bad or good? Well, let me give you, if you were in a face-to-face class, I would actually run it as an experiment. Since we cannot do it, due to the medium that we use, video lecture, I'll have to explain to you how this experiment goes. Here's what I do, and it's not my idea. Actually, the study was conducted at Duke and Harvard, but the idea is, easily replicable, and I do it with my students. So I would ask my students what they think about income inequality, and they would say, well, it's good, it's motivation, it's incentive to work harder. Then I would ask them, so what do you think the actual distribution of wealth is in the United States? And just like in that study by Harvard and Duke professors that showed what Americans think, my students tend to be quite close to that. So when I ask my students what do they think the distribution looks like, they say that roughly 50 or 60% of all wealth in America is owned by the top 20% of the wealthiest people. And when I ask them, what do you think the ideal distribution would be? Do you think that's good, or do you want it to be different? They say, no, that's not fair. Yes, the rich should have more than the poor, but not that much more. And they say the ideal distribution would be probably if the 20%, the richest 20% of the population owned 30%. So yes, they would be richer, in fact remarkably richer, compared to the poorest, but still, there would be some sort of a balance. And then I show them what the actual distribution is, and the truth is that in the United States, the top 20% of the population owns about 80% of all the wealth. And if you take top 1%, they still own more than, in fact, one top percent owns more than the bottom 50%. So 1% owns more than half of the population owns combined together. And so people then like, whoa, I never thought that it's so unequal. I mean, it's so different. And the funny thing is that while they initially criticize the socialist countries of Northern Europe, like Finland or Sweden or Denmark, when you ask them what their ideal income inequality distribution is, they would actually say that, we want what those countries have. So they say we want that the top 30% of the population owned about 30-35% of the wealth. And that's what the Japanese, the Northern Europeans have. So when you kind of take the emotional terms like capitalist, socialist, communist out of the equation and ask people about the numbers, remarkably, they actually tend to vote or propose solutions that are much more socialist and communist than they realize they are. And here are some of the latest figures on the United States and the world in terms of income inequality. I mean, remarkable. The world's top 1% owns half, 49% of the world's wealth. That's in the entire world. So if you happen to be in that top 1%, you literally, your cohort owns more than half of the entire population. The top 10% own 87% of wealth. I mean, we are talking about not, like in the United States, top 20% own, I mean, that's huge. Bottom 50% own only 0.8% of all the wealth in the world. I mean, half of the population, 3.5 billion of the people, own less than 1% of everything. And you are in top 50 if you are worth, like if your property, including your home, is more than $3,600. So pretty much everyone in the United States is better off than half of the population. If you own $77,000, including your home, again, which probably pretty much everyone in the United States, or most people in Europe for that matter, you are top 10%. Again, maybe except for the newly added European states. But if you go to Germany, France, the UK, the Netherlands, it seems like most people, just about everyone there is in top 10. And if you happen to have about $1 million, $798,000, you're top 1%. So now that is more selective. I mean, not many people are in that group, even in the United States. Though again, I mean, a house, that's what a house in a bigger city cost. And so many people have their houses paid off, so it's not quite as, unusual. But yes, that's just to give you a perspective as to how the wealth is distributed in the world and where you fall on that distribution. Now, some people say that maybe we shouldn't talk about the economic success in terms of the economic performance. Maybe there is more. I mean, as a classic said, Billy, it's not the money that I like, it's what I can buy with the money. And so the truth is that we work hard, not because we want the dollars, we want what we can buy with those dollars or euros or pesos or whatever country you are in. So some of the measures of kind of human well-being or quality of life are, for example, Human Development Index. This one takes into the account life expectancy, how much you work, working hours, education attainment, literacy, so things that make you happy, healthy, and allow you to enjoy life. And when you look at HDI, Human Development Index, some of the most capitalist societies like the United States, they do well. I mean, don't get me wrong, they still do fairly well. But they are not on top of the list. In fact, the more socialist countries tend to do better, like Switzerland, like Sweden, like Finland, like Canada, so like New Zealand. So they actually appear on top of the list and tend to do somewhat better. The United States does well, but again is not on top of the list. So it seems like, capitalism can make you richer, but not necessarily better off in terms of the quality of life. Here you also have a picture that shows life satisfaction. So that's the map of the world, how happy you are with your life. And as you can see, the picture also looks not quite in favor of the capitalist societies. It seems like Canada, New Zealand, again, the same countries that have a higher HDI, tend to be happier. And there are many countries that are rich but not happy. Like, for example, again, look at some of the Middle Eastern countries. Look at, for example, Russia, a relatively rich country. Wealth apparently doesn't help them. They are unhappy. And so, again, who am I to tell some guy in, I don't know, Africa who lives in the, in the prairies there, who owns nothing except for maybe his bow and arrows, who feels extremely happy, who am I to tell him that my lifestyle is better than his and my system is better than his? So, yeah, go figure. Here is a question that I'd like you to answer. It's likely to appear on the exam. And the answer clearly is none of these is a good indicator of, or is sufficient indicator of how the economic system or country is doing. They do give you something, but they do not provide a comprehensive, sufficient picture of how the country is doing. Now, final and most important question, so what? I mean, okay, economic systems are different. What does it mean to me as a business person? Well, there are all kinds of so what, and you can read them on this slide, but the big important is that you need to know what the differences are. It may determine the choice where you do business. It will definitely determine how you do business. The business practices or the skills that are valued in a free market economy are very different from the skills and practices in a planned economy, and that should be taken into account. So I have more information here in the slides as well as in the book, but yes, the way you will do business will be drastically different. Here is what you need to know on the exam. If you know that, you will do well. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video lecture.